You're listening to the Farmers Guardian podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Farmers Guardian podcast. On this week, we've got Farmers Guardian's news and business team, and we're going to be chatting through some of the top stories of the week. So we'll just introduce ourselves first of all. I'm Alex Black. I'm head of news and business.
Hiya, I'm Rachel Brown and I'm the chief reporter.
And I'm Jane Fine. I'm news and business reporter.
So if we start off with the front pages this week, Rachel, you wrote the front page for the main edition of FG. It was about confidence and a recent NFU survey. Just tell us a little bit about what the survey told us.
So the figures showed an all-time low for English and Welsh farmers in terms of short-term and mid-term confidence. They're the lowest since records began in 2010, with 82% of respondents saying their farm businesses had suffered fairly negative or very negative impacts. And it's important to point out, Alex, that it's across the whole sector, from mixed farms to arable farms to dairy farms, that have taken the biggest hits. It has been a relentless couple of months. This survey was actually undertaken in November and December last year. The NFU said if the survey had been done now, obviously off the back of the last few months of relentless rain, the figures would be even worse. And in terms of farm business profitability, they said it had fallen, with 65% of respondents saying their profits are declining. So some really, really stark figures there. And obviously it's been an extraordinary couple of months weather-wise for farmers, both arable farmers being impacted, but also livestock farmers in terms of turnout being delayed. But within that survey, a really poignant point is the lack of farmer confidence. Some of the reasons were highlighted, and one of them was this phase out of BPS, and that being a concern for farmers. So the NFU were very much kind of pushing for the government to change their direction in terms of the phase out of BPS, and calling it for it to be paused. And it's a really interesting discussion, isn't it? Because obviously we know that weather and the climate is changing a lot, and we can't always revert back to let's pause the BPS payments. There has to be a sustainable solution to this.
And, you know, the Conservative government, Steve Barclay's been quite clear that he doesn't want to pause the phase out of BPS, hasn't he?
No, absolutely. They've been very clear on that direction, that they want to continue on this path and phase out BPS. So it's really kind of, what else can they offer to farmers in terms of that cash flow solution? Because so many farmers are struggling in terms of cash flow, and there needs to be some form of support.
I think it's something that they could possibly revisit with the budget underspend after this year's harvest is going to be pretty dire, because obviously they reported that it was 400 million that was being added on. So it might be time now to invest that in farms that have been hit by the weather, after we had, things like Henry Ward, who, wasn't eligible for the support that was the flood support that was made available. So it might be time now to rethink that and see where some money could go.
Yeah, and I think all eyes will be on the Farm to Fork Summit that's happening next Tuesday. This will be the second annual summit hosted by Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, at number 10. I think at this point, let's try and reflect on what happened at last year's Farm to Fork Summit, and what's really been achieved in the last 12 months.
I think last year it was quite a groundbreaking event. It was something that Minette Batters, former NFU president, had really fought for. And I think everybody was pretty swept up in the fact that it was going to be at 10 Downing Street and that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was going to be there. What it turned into for some was a bit of a PR stunt. We had, there was a lot of focus on the celebrity farmers. I think there was lots of shots of Caleb and Rishi together in the garden. And what it was meant to discuss was things like supply chain issues, food price inflation, and the lack of farm investment. But I don't think anything immediately came out of that.
There was also an emphasis, wasn't there, on the farm security, what would they call it, the self-sufficiency. So real emphasis on kind of domestic food production and trying to get that index. I know that was something that Minette was really calling for, wasn't she?
Yeah. But I would say that things really haven't moved on. And we've had the EFRA committee again this year looking at supply chain unfairness. And yeah, I'm not sure many farmers would think that last year's was worthwhile.
I think from a dairy farmer perspective, we've had those supply chain fairness contracts, haven't we?
That's exactly what I was just going to say, Rachel. I suppose from the dairy perspective, we have moved on with that contract legislation going through Parliament, but I suppose the likes of the former NFU Dairy Board Chair, Michael Oakes, I think it's been about a decade since he's started campaigning for that legislation to go through. So it's not exactly, it has moved on in the past year, but it has been a long time coming anyway.
And still very much early days with those contracts, still a long way to go in terms of kind of having those conversations with the individual processors and those groups having those conversations. So we're still not really there yet with them. I think with the Farm to Fork Summit next week, there's going to be all eyes on it in terms of, from a tenant farmer's perspective, there's been a lot of conversation around the tenant landlord relationships. And I think there's a lot of speculation out there whether the Prime Minister will use the Farm to Fork Summit to announce a tenant farmer commissioner. Whether that happen or not, we don't know. Again, I think a lot of emphasis will be on food security. They're really trying to kind of hammer home that message, aren't they, that food security is national security.
I think the elephant in the room, though, for this is, on the back of the local election results, which we'll come to, is everything that's talked about, with the Prime Minister. It's very likely that looking at the polls, that he won't be in power for very long to implement things. We had the local election results last week. I know you've been reporting on that, Jane. So give us a bit of a rundown of the local election results and what it means for rural areas.
Well, in total in England, I think the Conservatives lost 474 councillors, which is one of their biggest losses ever. They also failed to win any of the sort of local mayors except for one. And this was a big thing that was introduced to give more rural areas devolution, to give them more control. So it was interesting that they actually didn't win any of those. And Labour actually took North Yorkshire and York, which is obviously Rishi Sunak's constituency. So that was won by David Scaife. The Lib Dems did make a lot of gains, especially in rural areas, and they took control of two councils, which was Dorset and Tunbridge Wells. And the Greens also made quite big steps this year and took 74 seats. They were up 74 seats. So it's not looking great. And the president of the CLA, Victoria Vivian, said, there's no traditional allegiance anymore, and that what these elections shown is that years and years of economic neglect, I think were her exact words, of rural areas have left a breakdown in traditional allegiances, saying that sort of the election is definitely up for grabs.
And I think that Lib Dem point's quite interesting, because obviously in a lot of rural seats there, maybe the second choice for a lot of rural areas, and they actually overtook the Tories, didn't they, in terms of council seats? So I'm not saying that will bear out exactly the same in a general election, but it would be a hell of a turnout for the Bucks if it did.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, they were up 104, and yeah, I think they gained more than they've ever done. So, yeah.
And on the flip side, obviously, rural communities and particularly farmers will be now wanting to hear from Labour. What are the specific objectives? What is their manifesto for rural communities going forward? I think they really want that detail now.
Yeah. I mean, the Conservatives were very quick to say, well, once Labour get in, it'll be even worse, and it'll be greenwashing, and, but I don't know. I think, there's a lot of work to do.
And in recent months, obviously, we've seen the Conservative Party almost play off the situation that's happening in Wales right now with Welsh Labour, and that distrust and kind of fragmented relationship with the Welsh farming community.
Yep, and they're out and about next week again, aren't they? There's a march planned next week.
So there's an expected march happening in Cardiff with farmers protesting against Welsh agricultural policies, specifically on bovine TB policy, MVZ regulations, so the water agricultural pollution regulations, but also obviously their farming support scheme, the sustainable farming scheme. So it'll be interesting. On the same day, actually, the new cabinet secretary, Hugh Aranka-Davies, is also expected to give an announcement, kind of an update to Senate members on the sustainable farming scheme proposal. It's off the back of this week, of course. We've had an announcement that there is a new ministerial roundtable. I think that's a message from the new cabinet secretary that he is listening to farmers. He wants to make sure that everyone is around the table to try and move this sustainable farming scheme in the right direction, because it does seem that they're not budging on the launch date. They want to get this sustainable farming scheme launched in January 2025, but there's a hell of a lot of work to get through to get to that point. And obviously we still got that very sticky, controversial point around the 10% tree target. So the cabinet secretary this week has announced that the key priority of this ministerial table initially will be to look at what he said further and alternative proposals to carbon sequestration within SFS. But obviously there's still the 10% tree target is still currently there. And there is question marks, because ultimately they need farmers to sign up to this scheme to be able to deliver on the targets that they're being held account to. And if they can't get that sign up, then what is the next steps?
No, exactly. And if we move north of the border as well, obviously been a lot of political upheaval up there. Humza Yousaf stepped down last week. Was it now? It's oh god, there's been a lot of politicking in the last few weeks, hasn't there? But Humza Yousaf stepped down after the collapse of the Butte agreement with the Greens. We've got John Swinney in place, who's being touted as the continuity candidate. What we've still got, we've had very minimal changes in the cabinet. We had obviously a change right at the top, change in the deputy, but the rest of the cabinets remained the same.
I think people in Wales and Scotland and very much here, I mean, we've had our fair share of DEFRA secretaries over the past couple of years. It just seems to be revolving doors, doesn't it now? We got policies coming and going, people coming and going, and I think, if he is a continuity candidate, I think that would be welcome, because, it does seem like, one in, one out at the minute.
And if there's any sector that needs continuity, it's the farming sector, isn't it? Because they need that long-term outlook. And if there's constant change through political doors, whether you're in England, Scotland, or Wales, it's not going to help them at all in terms of making investment and making decisions on farm. They need that long-term security and continuity within politics.
That relationship with the Greens as well is just going to be so important to see how Swinney handles that relationship, because obviously, I mean, that's what led to Humza Yousaf resigning, but it's has such a big impact on farming policy. If the Greens have that hold on the Scottish government, hold's probably the wrong term, but if they have that influence on the Scottish government, then that's going to really affect that farming policy that's still kind of being shaped up there.
I think it's important to point out, though, going back to the whole BPS, obviously in Scotland, they're in a different situation to what farmers are here in England. With the BPS, the Scottish Government have committed to continuing that, and that's a stark difference between the two. But those Scottish farmers and crofters have to work to get that reward of the BPS. So it's interesting how the different devolved nations are working, isn't it? And how we're at different stages when it comes to these future farming support.
Yes, definitely. It's really interesting to watch, after so long of, I suppose, farming policy coming from Europe and, being, across the whole of Europe, that now we have, so much difference between what's happening in England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I suppose staying with politics, one of the other big stories this week was the government's response to the Shropshire review into seasonal labour.
Yeah, so the visa's been extended to 2029 to kind of what the government said, to give farmers and growers the opportunity to invest in technology that can take over the reliance on seasonal workers. But it's interesting, isn't it, Jane? Because there has had some criticism, really. I know John Shropshire in particular, he was pleased and welcomed the fact that the visas had been extended, but the visa length was still only 6 months, and he would have preferred to have been 9 months. Within that same announcement by the government, there was also, investment around robotic pickers. And I'm interested to hear your kind of thoughts on that, Jane.
I think the worker the contracts and things like that, I think that will be welcomed. I think that's something, again, the NFU's campaign quite strongly on, and it was very much a big part of their horticultural strategy that the government then decided they weren't going to go forward with. So I think people will welcome that. But yeah, 50 million for robotics is sort of, yeah, it's. I think most horticultural businesses would say it's, not really worth it. The technology just isn't there, and I don't think 50 million, although it sounds quite a lot, I don't think it is there that would be rolled out on a lot of farms.
And 2029, like you say, it's a longer commitment, but it's not that far away for, having robotic pickers and changing that, that reliance on labor to pick crops. It's not, we're not looking right into the future for that, are we? 5 years time. I mean, is there going to be such a massive change in those 5 years?
I wouldn't think so. All the people I've spoken to in the sector, I wouldn't think so. And I think the hope, as ever, that we will get, domestic people involved in the sector. I think, again, that's something that's, possibly never going to happen. So
it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a lot of emphasis on trying to make, that particular sector of the industry more appealing for domestic workers. But it's been something that's kind of been said over and over again. But in reality, it's just not working. It's not attracting those workers in. So surely they need to kind of think of a different approach, really.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we've been doing it since just before the First World War. So it's, it is a big change. And even though living wage has gone up and things like that, it is seasonal. It's seasonal work. It's very hard work. And, it's not something that the domestic market seems to be.
I am proud, though, of the fact that I was a strawberry picker and I worked in a strawberry packing house during my years in between university to fund my travels. So it is, I can vouch for it, it is really hard work. But definitely good to kind of, if the weather's shining like today.
Yeah.
And I wonder what that emphasis on robotics actually has, on that domestic workforce. I suppose it's not really that an attractive proposal when they're telling you that you might be replaced by a robot in 5 years to get into the sector, is it?
Yeah.
It's contradictory, isn't it? No, definitely.
I think everybody who watched Clarkson's Farm last week would have seen Jeremy with his Henry Hoover. So 50 million would buy a good few of those. That might be it. Buy everybody one of them.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to scale that one up on the blackberry bushes. Yeah. Well, Clarkson's Farm, I suppose if we end on I don't know whether it is a lighter note, actually, having watched that 4th episode last night. But have you both been watching the series so far? We've had 4 episodes, and 4 episodes are going out today. So that'll keep us busy this weekend, no doubt.
Oh, definitely. It's been a bit of a roller coaster of emotions watching it. I mean, I'm a big fan. I think this particular series has done really good in terms of just highlighting sometimes the brutal nature of farming, that just doesn't always go your way. In terms of when you're looking after livestock, you could do all you can and just things can sometimes just be out of your hands. Like, for example, with the pigs, obviously, with the piglets and squishing the piglets, that's just so, it's so disheartening when you're doing all the hours and you're doing everything you can to try and, rear that your livestock to the best you possibly can, and then just things go against you.
Your family, Rachel, obviously you're not pig farmers, you're dairy farmers, but sitting watching that, I mean, you must have had calving, sat through calving.
And I think it's something that so many farmers can relate to this time around, because obviously we've just had lambing. It's been one of the worst lambing seasons, on record, really. It's been a really, really difficult, challenging season. On top of that, we've had Schmallenberg as well. We've got the threat of blue tongue. I think it's really topical conversation at the moment in terms of just how difficult it is rearing livestock, and particularly young livestock.
I think what struck me was when in the first episode, in the opening shots, it sort of showed these acres and acres of scorched earth and what they look like at the moment, which were probably, underwater, and it's just sort of brings us back to that. It's just so unpredictable, and support should be there really. Whether it's too hot or it's too windy or it's too flooded or whatever, there needs to be something in place to sort of help people.
No, definitely. And I think also the inevitable planning stuff comes up again, doesn't
Yay.
it continues with the farm shop. And I think, again, that's something that people watching can relate to, because there is this drive, particularly actually from Number 10 too, in terms of diversification, but also the practicalities of it in terms of planning permission. It's a lot harder than what it seems from the outside.
Yeah, it's very easy to sit and say, well, farmers should diversify, but then when you're launching your farm shop, or he's had his restaurant that's been shut down, and he's got all this opposition. Yeah, everything. He's come up with all kinds of ideas, hasn't he, to diversify, and been kind of shut down at every angle. So and he's got a lot of I suppose not all of us have got the backing that Clarkson has off people. Not all the farmers are going to have the queues coming to go to the farm shop that Clarkson has, but he's struggled getting things off the ground. So how are other farmers meant to be doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. I really liked the episode when Andy Cater and Caleb came head to head in the field, and that it was almost like Caleb was very dubious of Andy's kind of practices in the field. Obviously Andy is one of the founders of Wild Farmed, I believe, and obviously he's kind of taking that regenerative approach, and it was just really interesting to see that dynamic between the two. But actually I think what you can take from it is that everyone in the industry can learn from one another, and I think there's so much different things happening out there, different practices that we can all kind of take on board.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting watching Caleb as well. You said about the weather, Jane, but the decisions that he's having to sit and make, like whether to drill the oilseed rape or what crops that they're putting in, reacting to that weather. A lot of farmers will have been sat, making exactly those decisions. We've had all this weather that's impacted autumn plantings and now spring plantings, and a lot of people will have been sat going, well, this is what we normally do, but should we do it?
Oh, definitely. And I think also what's so lovely about it, there was the element of it when Jeremy Clarkson found out that Gerald had cancer, and just his response to it, and it kind of gives a sense that the farming community, we all, when people are having difficulties or challenges, we all kind of rally round and support one another, and I think that's such a nice thing to put across over television.
Definitely. I think that's something, I'm not from a farming background, Jane. I know you're not from a farming background, but it's something, when you come into this industry, obviously we're not farming, but, you come into this industry, you realize that community and that support and how welcoming it is, and how people, try and look after each other in the farming community. It's really apparent when you get in from the outside. Yeah. So I think that's quite a nice note to end the podcast on. It's been a busy week. We've had a lot of politics. We're going to have a lot of politics next week. Obviously the focus is going to be on this summit at Number 10, and then up in Scotland, seeing the first few days of the new First Minister's government. So, there's going to be a lot going on next week. There's going to be a lot going on beyond that. And of course, we'll all be sat watching the latest on Clarkson's farm. But that's it for this week's episode of the Farmers Guardian podcast. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back with another episode next Friday, and goodbye for now.